Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's presentation of the true nature of the climate crisis. And our presenter today is Dr. Zach Brown. Zach is the co-executive director of the Tidelines Institute. Zach grew up in a National Park Service family. He was surrounded by the wilderness of Alaska, which is America's fastest warming state. He attended Stanford University for his PhD studies and was incredibly privileged to undertake research expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctica seas aboard icebreaking ships, studying how ocean warming sea ice loss affects the polar ecosystem. Zach founded Tidelines Institute, which is an educational and leadership nonprofit in his Alaskan homeland, where he gives students real tools for climate action. And so with that, I would like to go ahead and welcome Zach. Thank you very much for doing this. We're all so excited to have you here. And again, Zach Brown, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Danito. I'm thrilled to be here. I love Arizona. I've spent a lot of time there. I've hiked around and done some rock climbing on Mount Lemmon. So I feel just really privileged to get a chance to talk with y'all. I wish I was there in person. Although I just heard that it's going to be like 106 today, and so climate is real. It's like, wow, you're very much on the front lines of that. It's about 52 degrees here in Southeast Alaska, where I am. Getting into the best month of the year. The coho salmon are starting to run up the rivers. I'm a birder myself. We've got here in Southeast Alaska, we don't have the diversity that you do, but we've got abundance, and we're the last readout of the marbled murrelet. That's a big one in our area here. So we've got a lot of ocean species. Anyway, I'm really excited to talk with you today about the real tools that the climate movement is using, and to make real change and move us beyond the fossil fuel era. I am coming into you, but beaming in from a town of about 400 people with no roads to it in the middle of the wilderness of Southeast Alaska. We're famous for glaciers and bears and breaching humpback whales. We're not famous for our internet speed. And so I'm actually going to go ahead and wave goodbye, kill my video, and start up my screen so that way we have maximum bandwidth for the slides and the audio, which is where the content is. And I'll come back up on screen when we enter the Q&A, which I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for. There's a lot to get through, but so off we go. Sharing. We go. Okay, hopefully y'all can see that. Let's get going with the true nature of the climate crisis. So this is where we're going today. Why aren't we changing? Why is the world failing to act on climate with anywhere near the speed and resolve that science demands? There's a lot of wrong answers floating around to this question, a lot of bad climate information out there. I'm going to try to clear a few things up today. Okay, so let's start here. What is the climate crisis not? It is not a scientific problem. This won't come to a surprise to people for the Audubon Society. Take it from me, I'm a climate scientist. We're not stuck in inaction because we don't know enough. We know plenty. The fact that carbon dioxide absorbs the same infrared wavelengths of radiation that the Earth emits, thus trapping its heat. It has nothing to do with politics or economics or religion or creed or belief or political party. It's just a fact, one that we've known about for well over a century. Now, what might come as a little more of a surprise is that climate change is also not a technology problem in terms of our solutions. What I'm showing here is new data from Michael Thomas. He's a renewable energy expert. Just take a look at solar energy's exponential price decline. In 1975, solar was so expensive, it would have cost you over $1 million to install a solar array on your rooftop. But by 2020, the International Energy Agency was reporting that solar is the cheapest electricity in history. Its cost fell by nearly half in 2023 alone. Just unbelievable. And what does that incredible price drop lead to? Well, vast expansion in solar energy. In about 20 years, global power generation from solar grew by more than 1,000 times. That is the fastest energy change in human history. Solar power installed last year, about 444 gigawatts or 444 billion watts. That's a staggering 80% year-on-year jump. It is more solar was installed last year than was installed cumulatively from the invention of the solar cell in 1954 until 2017. It is going gangbusters. Now, a few years ago, Bill Gates, currently the world's fifth richest man, decided he was going to turn his philanthropy toward the climate crisis, which is great. You know, we're glad that he's invested in the climate crisis rather than building himself a rocket ship to fly away from a burning planet. But he came out and said a misperception that's still all too common. We need an energy miracle to fix the climate crisis. Well, people from the climate movement who've actually been paying attention to what renewable engineers have achieved basically slapped their foreheads and said, no, Bill Gates, we don't need energy miracles. That makes it sound like at the moment we have no choice but fossil fuels, which is false. So Michael Liebrick, who's a global renewable energy expert, he responded, come on, Bill Gates, solar's price has dropped 400 times and solar deployment is up 1,000 times. How much more miracle-y do you need your miracles to be? This is our miracle. It has arrived. And I could show you comparable miracle graphs for wind power, for battery storage, for electric vehicles. The renewable energy revolution is moving so fast, it has demolished the predictions of the world's energy experts. That's not to say that there's not a big role for emerging technologies. There is, very exciting, promising things happening right now with enhanced geothermal, next generation nuclear, smart grids that manage electricity demand, and much more. But the point is, technology is not what's holding us back. As a colleague of mine from Stanford, Mark Jacobson, has published regularly these roadmaps to convert every nation on Earth and every US state to entirely wind, water, and solar power with existing technology. These roadmaps would create far more jobs than they would eliminate, and they would save millions of human lives, mainly through the reduction of air pollution, which causes some 10 million premature deaths every year around the world. I mean, it's a holocaust every single year. It's 1 in every 5 deaths on planet Earth. By the time I finish this talk, over 1,000 people will have died from breathing the poison that's emitted whenever we burn fossil fuels. It is a public health crisis beyond anything else in world history, even if climate change weren't happening. Any sane society would be working overtime to prevent these millions of entirely preventable deaths. So many reasons beyond climate change to make the renewable energy transition. So we create jobs, we save millions of lives, and an added bonus, we avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change. Really hard to see what's not to like about this. So again, we return to our framing question, why aren't we doing it? Well, to understand that, we can look to the work of Bill McKibben, who's one of our greatest living climate warriors. In 2012, McKibben published a sobering article in Rolling Stone, one of the most important articles ever written. This was the cover of that issue of Rolling Stone. Justin Bieber, hot, ready, legal. But if you look in the top right, there's an article called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, in which McKibben lays out 3 numbers that clearly show the true nature of the climate crisis. Now, these numbers have changed in the past decade. This article is outdated, but the takeaway, the message remains absolutely spot on. Okay, so the first number, 2 degrees Celsius. This is our safe ceiling for average global temperature rise relative to pre-industrial temperatures. In other words, this is how much we can warm the planet before Armageddon hits. Spiraling extreme weather disasters, famines, droughts, heat waves that kill millions and displace so many more, it creates a refugee crisis beyond imagining, the death of every coral reef on the planet, the flooding of Earth's coastal cities. This is our world at 2 degrees. Now, to put this in context, so far, humans have warmed the Earth about 1.2 degrees Celsius, but it's important to understand that even if we stopped emitting tomorrow, the planet would continue to warm to perhaps 1.5. There's a lot of inertia built into something as massive and complex as the global climate system. So we've already locked in around 1.5 degrees, and our limit is 2 degrees. The second number, 565 gigatons. or 565 billion metric tons. This is the amount of additional carbon we can emit from here onward and still stay below the 2-degree threshold. That is, this is our carbon quota. Basically, if we burn less than this, we're kind of okay. But if we burn more, it's Armageddon. Now, each year, humanity emits something like 35 gigatons of carbon. And you do the simple math, you'll see we don't have a lot of time to screw around before we surpass our quota of carbon we can safely emit, especially considering this article was written a decade ago. Here's how Greta Thunberg summed up our carbon budget in a recent video. Any of you remember Gangnam Style? This was the first video on YouTube ever to reach 1 billion views. Well, that video was longer ago than we have left to avoid climate Armageddon. The third number, 2,795 gigatons. This is the amount of carbon that would be released if we dug up and burned all proven fossil fuel reserves, all the coal, oil, and gas that nations and fossil fuel companies are sitting on. Now, technically, this carbon is still in the ground, but as McKibben points out, it is economically above ground. It is the basis for fossil fuel company share prices on the stock market. Companies are borrowing against it, trading it, using it as collateral. Entire nations are basing their budgets on it. In other words, this is the amount of carbon we are planning to burn. And it won't have escaped your notice that 2,795 is greater than 565, 5 times greater. On the right is the amount climate scientists say is safe to burn. On the left is the amount we are planning to burn. This is what Greta Thunberg means when she says, I want you to panic. But before you panic, take a look at the implication here. What this implies is that in order to have a hope of staying within the 2-degree limit, in order to avoid climate Armageddon, we need to leave 80% of these proven fossil fuel reserves in the ground, right? Does that make sense? We know that 5 times more than can be safely burned is under our feet, so we can only burn 1/5 of it. 80% has to stay in the ground. But here's the kicker. Here's where we come to the fourth number. That 80% of proven fossil fuel reserves, known as the unburnable carbon, represents some $20 trillion in profits to the fossil fuel industry. Now we can begin to see the true nature of the climate crisis. Try telling ExxonMobil or BP or Chevron they have to leave $20 trillion in the ground. You might think they won't like that very much. And they're going to fight tooth and nail to ensure the number we burn is the one on the left, not the one on the right. So let's dig into the true nature of the climate crisis. It won't surprise any of you here to learn there are some ties between the fossil fuel industry and government. Now, we could talk about any of dozens of governments around the world of fossil fuel producing nations or US states, but for the sake of argument, let's call it the US federal government. There is an exchange going on here. There's an arrow going in this direction. What does the fossil fuel industry do for government? Well, the big one is campaign finance. In the US, the disastrous 2010 Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, redefined corporations as people and redefined campaign contributions as free speech. That's allowing corporations to pour virtually unlimited and undisclosed amounts of money into elections. There is a tsunami of oil money sloshing through our government. The industry spent tens of millions on the most recent election cycle, the 2022 midterms. We don't even know how much because so much goes through dark money channels so that its source is concealed. Campaign finance is legalized bribery. I pay to put you in office. Now I own you. Bought and paid for. I scratch your back. You better scratch mine. How about lobbying? According to Open Secrets, the oil and gas industry spent $124 million lobbying the US federal government last year and a whole bunch more to state governments. That's just the various ways the industry pushes for policies that benefit them. Now, there's an arrow the other way. What does government do for the fossil fuel industry in return? About subsidies, tax breaks. According to the International Monetary Fund, the fossil fuel industry globally is subsidized to the tune of $13 million every minute. $13 million every minute. Subsidies make fossil fuels artificially profitable for fossil fuel companies and artificially cheap for consumers so that we're happy to fill up our giant gas guzzlers. Remember this next time someone crows about the free market. They'll tell you renewable energy is great, but it just can't compete in the free market. Well, ain't no free market when fossil fuels are being subsidized at $13 million a minute. How about a recent headline? Topping estimates with a $36 billion profit. Can anybody please tell me why the taxpayers are still subsidizing this? Policy. Policies like being able to drill on federal lands, reduction of oversight and regulation, not having to disclose, for example, the slurry the fracking industry is pumping into our groundwater, policies that make it harder for people to purchase electric vehicles or add rooftop solar, on and on. And especially under the Trump administration, we saw political appointments. That's people from the fossil fuel industry coming straight into government. An almost unbelievable example is Rex Tillerson, who went directly from the CEO of ExxonMobil to US Secretary of State. Whose interest do you think he was pushing as America's most powerful diplomat? Us, the voters? And around this nefarious circle we go. And out of this nefarious circle, of course, is spawned climate change denial. There's nothing grassroots about climate denial. It comes straight from the top. Lies peddled by the fossil fuel industry to cast doubt on the science and delay action in order to preserve their profits. Over the last few years, we've seen more and more revelations about Exxon misleading the public and its own investors. This is copiously documented. And so you get headlines like this one from The Economist. Fossil fuel barons have poured more than 100 million into these campaigns, raising concerns over special interests. I mean, that's just the understatement of the 21st century. Special interests run our government, particularly the fossil fuel industry. I remember I had a chance to go see Al Gore speak when I was at Stanford University. Powerful speaker. I'll never forget his words. He said, "We can't solve the climate crisis until we solve the democracy crisis." And we have one. In the United States, we don't even live in a real democracy anymore. We live in an oligarchy where the wealthiest industries control our government. So the climate crisis and the democracy crisis are one and the same. Let's talk about a few actors in the democracy crisis that drives the climate crisis. In my opinion, these two are the greatest climate criminals in world history. Here are Charles and David, the infamous Koch brothers, who made their fortune on oil and gas. Well, actually, their fortune was given to them by their daddy, like most billionaires. But they used that fortune to thoroughly corrupt the US government, creating, in effect, a private mega bank for conservative politicians. So if you sign on to their extreme neoliberal agenda, the centerpiece of which is ferocious resistance to any climate action, well, then the piggy bank is open and they'll fund your campaign. But if you dare to do anything to help us avert climate catastrophe, they will buy your replacement. These two are the primary reason why the modern Republican Party in the United States refuses to take any climate action. As just one example, their political network poured almost $1 billion into the 2016 presidential election. I think you all know what happened in 2016. Let's just say they got what they wanted. How about Senator James Inhofe from Oklahoma, major oil and gas producing state? He's one of the great granddaddies of climate denial, infamous for calling climate change, quote, "the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people." Then when it snowed in Washington, D.C., he brought a snowball onto the Senate floor to prove that it's a hoax. Why would he try to convince the American people that climate change is a hoax using such an idiotic stunt? Easy. The fossil fuel industry paid him to. And he took nearly $500,000 from oil and gas for his latest reelection. And again, that's only what's trackable. But I consider Mitch McConnell to be the third greatest climate criminal in history after Charles and David Koch. He spent his career as the Republican Senate leader, turning the United States Senate into the greatest tool of climate obstruction the world has ever seen. Through the anti-majoritarian composition of the US Senate and anti-majoritarian tools like the filibuster, he ensured that for decades, the United States Senate never passed a single piece of climate legislation, nor ratified a single international treaty to slow the flow of carbon into the atmosphere. His obstruction, by the way, was finally overcome in 2022, as we will see. So why would he spend his career blocking climate action? Easy. The fossil fuel industry paid him to. He took around $250,000 from oil and gas in his latest reelection. I can't imagine what that number would be if we had the full scope of it. And by the way, do you notice any other similarities between these climate criminals other than their fossil fuel ties? They're all rich, old, white men. That when you come to understand the world in this way, the links between patriarchy and white supremacy and a fossil fuel economy, petromasculinity, the links between climate justice and social justice become manifest. So my point, there is no longer any bright line separating the fossil fuel industry from government, and there's a word for this blurring of lines, and that word is corruption. And you don't have to take my word for it. The corruption of the US government that drives the global climate crisis is copiously documented by some of our best investigative journalists. I'm, I'm tickled looking at these titles and seeing that all these brave journalists are women, fitting contrast to the rich old white men we've just surveyed. I think it suggests a common sense change to our leadership, don't you? And it's not just in the United States, but the United States is in some ways uniquely corrupted. And what is the result of all this corruption? Well, predictably, policies that favor the fossil fuel industry and kill renewables. Thankfully, we are no longer living under the Trump administration, which was so corrupted by the fossil fuel industry, it would have been comical if it hadn't been so tragic. Just Bond villain corrupt, just stacking every energy and environment government position with fossil fuel goons like Scott Pruitt and Rick Perry and Rex Tillerson, more old white men who spent their time just destroying American environmental protections. Most notoriously withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, which thankfully Biden's administration has rejoined. But once you start looking at the world through this lens of corruption, you will see it every time you open a newspaper or scroll through social media. The examples just go on and on. Will Koch pull the plug on electric cars? Rooftop solar dims under pressure from utility lobbyists. The Koch brothers are still trying to break wind. At least that one has a comical title. A coke-fueled attack on electric buses picks up speed. We can't even get electric buses in this nation without the fossil fuel industry coming in on the attack. I mean, what chance do we have? Killing public transit projects around the country. Pipeline to the classroom, how big oil promotes fossil fuels to America's children. It's sick. It's just nauseating. It's not just financial corruption or political corruption, it's moral and spiritual corruption. And as the wealthy world adopts renewable energy and electrifies their economies, big oil sees the opportunities in poor African nations where they're working to drive up use of fossil fuel cars, buses, and planes. They call it the Oil Demand Sustainability Program. They're like drug dealers, pushing their deadly products, trying to addict as many nations as possible before the world moves on. Big oil tells us, they're just innocently supplying the world's insatiable demand for energy. That's bullshit. They're out there every day creating that demand by ensuring that our collective response to the climate crisis fails. They are creating that demand. Part of creating and maintaining demand is advertising. Last month, the industry launched its Lights On energy campaign, over $100 million, pushing the myth that fossil fuels are reliable, that they lead to energy security, and that they are vital to our future. None of these are true. The real goal, of course, which the American Petroleum Institute is very clear about, is to, quote, dismantle policy threats to the industry, which is to say, to kill climate action. And as the World Meteorological Organization was reporting that 2023 was the hottest year ever experienced by the human species, big oil was walking back their already meaningless pledges. So now, after a couple of wrong answers, we have the right answer to the question we began with. Why aren't we changing? The fossil fuel industry won't let us. We are not held back from solving this crisis by a lack of scientific understanding or a lack of technology or because it will hurt the economy or destroy jobs. The climate crisis is a political crisis because the fossil fuel industry, with its vast amounts of money in our broken political system, can buy power. It buys politicians. It buys policies that lock us into fossil fuels. That's why I'm here telling you that the fossil fuel industry is the enemy in the climate change fight. Their business model is based on burning 5 times as much carbon as the atmosphere can safely absorb, and they know it. And I hope I've convinced you in the last few slides, they have no intention of changing that business model. These corporations will not stop. They are incapable of stopping. All corporations can do is seek profit. They know no moral code. They have no conscience. Leaving $20 trillion in profits in the ground is impossible. They will watch the world burn before they give up their profits. That is the true nature of the climate crisis. Now, a question comes to our mind when we see a statement like this. Well, wait a minute. We all use fossil fuels. Most of us have cars, fly on planes, eat food that was shipped from other climates. Therefore, we're all complicit in climate change. How can you rail against fossil fuels when you use fossil fuels? So let's get into the role of personal action, personal responsibility, hypocrisy. Extremely important point. That's where we're going right now, okay? Now, a few years ago, an important paper came out in the journal Science by Elise Amel and her colleagues. These are environmental psychologists, which I think is a pretty cool line of work. And what they imagined was an individual person who's looking to do their part to change the world, to fix climate change. But well, it's more interesting to be specific rather than general. So let's use as our individual John James Audubon. Here he is in the early 19th century, doing his best impression of a frontiersman. So John James Audubon, well, let's say he wants to fix the environmental challenge, and one of the things that he does to reduce his carbon footprint is to ride a bicycle. Okay, so Elise Amel and colleagues, they identified various spheres of influence that a person can have. The first is the private and personal, okay? So this is the classic reduce, reuse, recycle level of action. For John James, it means, riding his bicycle around town. And that's great. We like that. But that might not be enough for him. He might look to the next circle and encourage his friends and neighbors to also ride their bicycle around. He might help inflate their tires, lube up their chain, make sure that they have a good bike to use. But even that might not be enough. John James might look to the next circle and actually start a community organization dedicated to bicycles. They set up little bike maintenance shop that people can use for free, help people with education about the benefits, like being able to hear the birds when you ride a bike, and better mental and physical health. Okay, but he might even move now to the next level, which is the public level. John James Audubon runs for president on the bicycle platform and says, everyone needs to ride bikes now. This was, of course, before the era of the automobile, but automobiles are outlawed. Everyone has to ride a bike, okay? So yeah, good luck getting that one through Congress. But once John James Audubon preaches the bicycle gospel enough, we reach the biggest sphere, and that is cultural. This is when we don't even need a law forcing us to ride our bikes, because of course we're going to ride our bikes. That's our culture. If you don't ride a bike, you're not part of our tribe and you can leave. We are bike people. It's part of our founding myth, But Elise Amel and colleagues did something crucial here, which is they put an axis on this diagram, and it goes from smallest impact at the top to largest impact at the bottom. And what it shows is that the private and personal is the least impactful thing that we can do. If we want to fix climate change, this cannot be all that we aspire to. This is a global systemic problem that requires global systemic solutions. Think about what we've seen so far. Do you think fossil fuel executives are operating on the private and personal level? Do a thought experiment with me. Imagine you are the board of directors of ExxonMobil. Okay, so get into character. You're all rich, old, white men. Okay, and I'm the chair of the board. And I come to you and say, here's our strategy for growing the company, fellas. We're going to use more fossil fuels as individuals. Okay, we're going to always use plastic straws, and we're never going to bring reusable grocery bags, and never buy the organic yogurt, and never ride a bike. Always drive your car. And I want you each to commit to eating a bloody steak instead of a salad at least 3 times a week. And I want you to take long showers, at least 15 minutes long. And if we all do our part, then that's going to increase demand for fossil fuels just a little bit. And that's going to make ExxonMobil more profitable. You think that's how they're operating? Hell no. I'll tell you the levels that the fossil fuel industry is operating on. They're operating where the real power is. They're operating on the public level by influencing elections through donations by gaining political appointments, lobbying, fueling voter suppression efforts, stacking the Supreme Court with conservative justices who will overturn climate action. And they're operating on the cultural level by funding a sustained campaign to create a culture that distrusts science, and advertising to create a culture where to be a man, you have to drive a V8 F350 truck that gets 8 miles to the gallon. So if we're stuck up here wailing about our personal carbon footprint and wondering what's the right yogurt to buy, and they're down there where the real power is, that nefarious circle will just keep on turning. This is why touting the personal carbon footprint to ourselves, to our friends and families, is actually a disservice because it's a false tool. This is what the industry wants us to believe, that it's our fault, and the only way to fix climate change is to fix ourselves. Because as long as we believe that, we'll be stuck trying to change as individuals without changing the system, and they can keep right on drilling. So if the personal carbon footprint is our least effective tool, why has it taken over the narrative? Why does everyone obsess over it? Surprise! It's because of the fossil fuel industry. You want me to really blow your mind? The whole concept of the carbon footprint is a fossil fuel industry propaganda conjured up by BP in 2005 in a $100 million ad campaign. Here's what that ad campaign looked like. Look how they shift the blame. Call it your mark on the world. CO2 emitted due to your daily activities. Meanwhile, they are absurdly rebranding themselves Beyond Petroleum, even as they continue to lobby the government and fight tooth and nail against any policies to reduce the systemic addiction to fossil fuels. This ad campaign was 19 years ago. How do you think BP has done in those 19 years at moving beyond petroleum? Well, here's a headline from just last year. BP dials back climate pledge amid soaring oil profits. By the way, they quietly dropped the name Beyond Petroleum. Now they're just BP because the old ways were just too profitable. This is where it's at. Mary Heglar, a badass young woman of color, one of our best environmental writers. I don't care if you recycle. We've been talking about recycling and other personal actions for 3 decades. And in that time, carbon emissions have skyrocketed, growing by over 50%. Take on the fossil and gas industry instead. What can I as an individual do about climate change? Well, this is one of the most common questions McKibben gets as one of our foremost climate activists. He gives a simple answer. Become less of an individual. Join the movement for climate justice. Social change is achieved through movements. The 20th century saw many that used nonviolent civil disobedience to achieve political ends. Here's Mohandas Gandhi leading the Salt March to protest the British salt monopoly in India by walking hundreds of kilometers to the coast and illegally making his own salt by evaporation. Through this and other acts of protest and nonviolent civil disobedience, India finally gained independence in 1947. Of course, we're all familiar with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, speaking to 250,000 Americans at the Lincoln Memorial. MLK didn't try to get one white person at a time to fix their discrimination footprint by, say, doing one nice thing to a black person each day. No, he and his millions of followers demanded change at the highest level from President Lyndon B. Johnson, who ultimately signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Likewise, gay marriage was not won by individuals fixing their homophobia footprint. It was won by a movement. Here's one of the first pride parades in New York City with thousands of balloons held by people from across America saying dignity. Ultimately, the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage in 2015. The death of apartheid was won not only by a South African movement, but a global movement. This image shows George Washington University students marching in front of the South African embassy. Boycotts, divestment, and other movement tools led to Nelson Mandela being freed from prison in 1990 and ultimately the end of apartheid. And likewise, the climate movement is winning climate action. That is where it's at. Okay, so let's talk about the tools, the real tools that the climate movement is using. Now, this is the true nature of the climate crisis, the nefarious circle. Even though it is infuriating, I also find it empowering because once we understand this, we recognize that fixing the climate crisis is not as complex as we've been led to believe. It really comes down to one thing: breaking these arrows. Simple. Not easy, that's for sure. Not easy, but simple. The climate crisis is about power. Who has it and who doesn't? Do the people have the power through free and fair elections and representatives who actually listen to them? Or does the fossil fuel industry have the power by buying politicians and lobbying them to block action? If you only take one thing from this presentation, take this: our task as climate citizens is to take the fossil fuel industry out of power. So what tools is the climate movement using to break this circle, to disempower the fossil fuel industry? Well, it ain't reusable grocery bags. Okay. I'm just going to share a few of them. This list, there's too many to get into with any kind of depth. Real tools number one: it is a frigging exciting time to get involved in climate because, like I said at the outset, our energy miracle has arrived. Building the new energy future is how we make fossil fuels irrelevant. In Europe, renewables just overtook fossil fuels in the electricity sector, which nobody would have predicted even a few years ago. This is no longer alternative energy. We're no longer celebrating a few solar panels going up on some hippie's house. We're talking about powering entire continents, which is, of course, exactly the scale we need to be thinking at. Now, when we say clean electrification, that's really our core climate solution with two components. First, build vast amounts of clean electricity: solar, wind, nuclear, batteries, geothermal. And second, electrify our society, our households, our workplaces, where we play and pray, all of our energy services, our heating and cooling, our cooking, our transportation. All of this can be done with clean electrons rather than dirty molecules. So with the the electrify everything side of the equation, California is getting in on the act. This announcement in late 2022 is a big deal, following earlier announcements by Norway, India, Japan, the UK, many other nations. California is the world's 5th largest economy and among its largest car markets. Now, all right, is it better to have walkable and bikeable cities? Oh, yeah. Is it better to have robust public transportation that's free and clean and people want to use? You're damn right. And I hope that in the coming decades, we'll take steps towards far fewer cars, which improves mental and physical health and quality of life in so many ways, as shown by the amazing things happening in Paris and Amsterdam and other cities that have taken impressive steps to limit cars. But listen, when you're trying to change the world, we start from the world we have, not the world we wish we had. And in the world we have, especially here in the US, especially in Arizona, the world we have is dominated by cars. And in that world, this chart showing the exponential growth of EVs is very, very, very good news. It has led the good folks at The Economist to eulogize the internal combustion engine. And mostly because of the explosive growth of EVs, the International Energy Agency now projects that peak oil demand is just around the corner. Soon, the world will be burning less oil year after year. Thank God. We've been waiting for this, praying for this, hoping for this, working for this for decades. And now the world is going to start burning less oil, and it's because of EVs. Now, some of you are thinking right now, well, wait a minute. What about all the minerals it takes to build EVs and deploy renewable energy? Aren't we just trading one extractive economy for another? And the answer is an emphatic no. We are not. Lithium is not the new oil. A renewable economy requires as much as 1/1000th of the total extraction of a fossil economy. What I'm showing here is the total amount of fossil fuels humanity digs up and burns each year. This is for 2019. It totals around 15 billion tons. Now, let's compare that to what we have to dig up for a renewable economy. In 2020, that totaled around 7 million tons. Million, not billion. And even with aggressive deployment of renewables through 2040, it's a teeny tiny fraction of what we dig up for a fossil economy. Now, I don't want to minimize real concerns about mining lithium or cobalt or other minerals for renewables, Just because it's 1,000 times less extraction doesn't mean we're not going to dig some new holes. And digging these holes causes real problems and should be done in as environmentally and culturally sensitive ways as possible. But please, for the love of God, when we talk about mining for renewables, we must put that in the context of what we're doing every day, which is far more damaging, 1,000 times more harmful to ecosystems, 1,000 times more human rights abuses. Fossil fuels are wildly inefficient for at least 3 reasons. First, no fossil fuel is recyclable. It just pours its byproducts into our air and water, whereas solar panels, wind turbines, and especially batteries are increasingly recyclable. A far bigger impact is summed up by this quote from Thomas Edison. Burning things is inherently wasteful. A typical internal combustion engine is something like 25% efficient at turning the chemical energy of the gasoline into motion, meaning 3/4 of all gasoline serves no useful purpose. It just burns up in heat and friction, polluting our world while doing no work whatsoever. You know how efficient an EV is at turning the chemical energy of the battery into motion? Around 95% efficient. Perhaps most important, when you build a solar array, yeah, you had to mine some minerals in order to build that solar array, but now your job is done. The energy just comes to it, flowing out of the sky like a damn miracle every time the sun rises above the horizon. Contrast that with building a coal-fired power plant. Building that plant still requires mining and resources. Oh yeah, but once you've built it, your job is just getting started because you have to keep digging up, refining, and transporting its fuel forever. You want me to really blow your mind? How much of global shipping, super tankers, trains, long haul trucks, do you think is just moving fossil fuels around to be burned? The answer is 40%. So by moving to a renewable economy, nearly half of global shipping will just be obviated. It will just vanish. It shows how efficiency makes new gains possible we might not have thought of. There are so many reasons to move to a renewable economy, even if climate change were not a thing. So if a renewable economy is so much more efficient and requires so much less extraction, why do we have this narrative about the disaster of mining for renewables? Surprise, it's the fossil fuel industry again. They've largely moved from lying about the basic science of climate change to lying about the solutions, trying to discredit renewable energy, trying to convince us that EVs are just as bad as gas cars. They aren't, and it's not close. Okay. Now, looking at Arizona, just earlier this year in terms of clean electrification, Arizona could be the nation's great solar powerhouse, and it's not. Earlier this year, the Arizona's Public Utility Commission, the Arizona Corporation Commission, voted to scrap the renewable energy standards that the Arizona legislature had adopted years before. This is the only state I'm aware of that has backpedaled on its climate commitments, whereas most states are moving to more aggressive targets. And guess what? All 4 Republicans on the commission voted to scrap the targets, and the 1 Democrat voted to keep them. Now, when it comes to clean electrification, you can get in on the act in your household. If you live here in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act will give you financial incentives to get an EV, rooftop solar, an electric water heater, a heat pump. That's the most efficient way of heating and cooling a house. Or a magnetic induction stove to get those poisonous flames out of your kitchen, keep your kids from getting asthma. You can break up with fossil fuels. You can banish them from your daily life. It's not me, it's you. Okay, real tools number 2, stop the money pipeline. Finance is the newest front in the climate wars. As Bill McKibben puts it, money is the oxygen on which the climate crisis burns. And all of our major banks and all of our major money lenders and all of our major money managers are throwing billions of dollars at fossil fuel expansion because you know what? It's still profitable. And that's just nihilism. I'm going to destroy the planet in order to profit. Wall Street is financing climate destruction. The preeminent group that's pushing them is called Stop the Money Pipeline, pushing them to invest in our future, not our past. Closely related to that is divestment, which is a movement led by faith-based organizations, colleges, and universities. I wish that I had time to get into real tools number two. This is just a huge one. Follow the money. Where is the money going and who is making those decisions? But unfortunately, we have to keep moving. A subset of the climate movement is putting their bodies on the line as just in order to blockade fossil fuel projects and infrastructure. A big goal is simply to slow these things down so that they become more expensive and ultimately risk regulation or other factors catching up with them and ultimately getting canceled. As just one of thousands of examples I could put up, these are the kayaktivists blockading the port of Seattle and the Polar Pioneer Shell's drill rig to try to go drill the Arctic, which, by the way, they're only trying to go drill because they melted it in the first place. So now they can go drill. Again, we don't have time to get into real tools number three. How about litigation? Real tools number four. There are dozens now of cities, states, and even entire nations that are suing big oil for damages. Let's just take Arizona, which is not yet, but Arizona is facing billions of dollars of damage from the climate crisis. Who should have to pay those damages? Is it you all on this call, the taxpayers? Or is it the industry that has been knowingly making this crisis worse while profiting off it in the billions? That's what these mounting lawsuits allege, is that the polluter should have to pay for these damages. And so far, none of these lawsuits have held the fossil fuel industry accountable. Nothing has. But as the sheer number of lawsuits mounts, it only becomes more likely. Okay. Now, here's the biggest tool in our toolkit. Political mobilization is the biggest lever we have to make change. That's because governments write the laws. No amount of nonprofit work like the Audubon Society or my nonprofit Tidelines Institute, no amount of shifting markets, no amount of individual action, personal carbon footprint, voluntary carbon offsets can match the power of city, state, and federal governments to enact policies that bring real change. The rules of the game right now heavily favor fossil fuels, and only governments have the power to change those rules. If we elect climate champions, we get climate action. It's as simple as that. It's true in Arizona, it's true in Alaska, it's true in the United States. And it's true across the world. Here are two quick examples. Starting with a state where climate deniers hold power. What does the Texas legislature do with that power they hold? Well, try to kill its booming renewable energy sector. Compare that with Michigan, which in the 2022 midterms gained a trifecta for climate champions who now control both state houses and the governorship. What do they do with that newly earned power? Well, pass ambitious clean energy goals and a suite of other climate legislation. This would never have passed if climate deniers had power in either state house or the governorship. If they had had power to block it, they absolutely would have. The climate crisis is about power. It's not complicated. Everywhere you look across the US or the world, it's the same story. If you want ambitious climate action, elect climate champions. But the US federal government may still be the most powerful on earth, and in a generation, in 35 years, it did virtually nothing about the greatest crisis to face humanity. So the Sunrise Movement, this is the political arm of the youth climate movement, took it on in the run-up to the 2020 elections. Sunrise managed to elevate climate for the first time to the top of the Democratic agenda, to the point that every major presidential candidate on the Democratic side in 2020 swore off fossil fuel donations. This is a big, big deal. Our president, Joe Biden, is the first in a century who has not been bought and paid for by the fossil fuel industry. And that's exactly why he had by far the most aggressive climate agenda of any presidential nominee in US history. The climate crisis is about power. Who has it and who doesn't? Well, a headline like this is a sure indication that the fossil fuel industry's political power is waning. Better yet, thanks to the tireless organizing from Sunrise and dozens of other groups and thousands of individuals, Biden takes office in 2021 with a bare majority in the US House and Senate. That's called power. So what does Biden and other climate champions do with that power? They pass the Inflation Reduction Act with hundreds of billions of dollars for the green transition. It is a huge, huge deal, possibly the biggest climate legislation in world history. It's an absolute game changer. That's what you get when you build sufficient political power. You get action. It can't be repeated too many times. The climate crisis is about power. If climate deniers, if Republicans had had just one more vote in the United States Senate, they would have blocked this bill. It's not even a question. And now the Heritage Foundation and other right-wing partners have brought us Project 2025, the plan, if Trump wins, to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, gut the EPA, eliminate the Department of Energy to hamstring the clean energy transition, eliminate drilling regulations, and so much more. Just a wish list for the oil and gas industry. The corruption is so blatant that Trump met with a bunch of oil CEOs and said, give my campaign $1 billion and I'll give you anything you want. Thankfully, we have a dynamic, exciting climate champion at the top of the ticket on the Democratic side. And this is just, this is the fight of our lives. We have 61 days until the most important election, perhaps in global history, because it will determine, the physical and biological systems of this planet. As most of you probably know, the US presidential election is decided by this ridiculous mechanism called the Electoral College, which disenfranchises most Americans. In 43 of the 50 US states, your vote doesn't matter for the president. It only matters in 7 swing states: Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. I will be in Tucson on October 12 in person, speaking with a group of Stanford alumni, and perhaps you and I can talk about how to get a few more butts in seats, who need to hear this message. And then I'm traveling to Pennsylvania later in October to speak on climate change at colleges and university campuses to try to rally young folks to get involved. How can you get involved? Myriad ways. Contact everyone you know in Arizona. Everyone, everyone. Sit down and make a list of every single person you know and contact them. Ask them if they have a plan to vote, and if they're getting more involved, going beyond their one vote to volunteer and donate. And you say, but Tucson will vote blue. What's the point? Wrong. Margins matter. In a statewide election, it matters whether 82% of Tucson votes for Kamala versus 81%. That could be the difference between her winning that state and not. Just like in rural Trump country in Arizona, it matters whether Kamala wins 26% or 28% of the vote. The margins matter at every single part of the state. So I cannot emphasize enough, please get involved in the election of our lives. We have 61 days before and we will not get these days back. They will decide our climate future. I would just, this is the final real tools here, is just join. This is the greatest crisis ever faced by humanity. Who wants to face it alone? Not only will we be ineffective, we'll be sad and lonely. We're a social species. We need the bonds of community. When we join the movement, we find solidarity is a wonderful balm for the hurt of climate grief. When there's less birdsong in the air year after year, you will have people around you that are fighting the good fight with. That's my wish for you. Find your place within the climate movement. People out there want to tell you the one best thing you can do for the climate. They'll say the one best thing you can do is vote, or the one best thing you can do is go vegetarian. This is crap. It completely misses the mark. First of all, are you supposed to just go vegetarian and then ignore the world's greatest crisis in all other aspects of your life? But more importantly, it totally ignores that we all have different passions, skills, roles that we bring to this movement. What are you good at? What do you love to do? What fires you up? There's a place in this movement for artists, engineers, office workers, janitors, executives, everybody. And when done right, The climate movement is empowering, it's inspiring, it can even be fun. You can get a community climate group together, a bunch of birders, you can cry, cry on each other's shoulders, but you can go hiking together. You can laugh together, you can have cocktails together and celebrate the wins together. And the climate movement is notching an awful lot of wins these days. And if we all join the movement, we're going to win a better world. Thank you very much for your attention. I've probably gone way over time, but it's been a real pleasure. I'm going to share my screen again, or I'm going to start my camera. And I would love to hear what questions you have. And by the way, yeah, we're almost at the hour. I will stay beyond the hour to continue to field questions, since I only left a few minutes here. Okay, so I can stay as long as there's a good conversation going.
All right, cool. Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. Yeah, I'm not really up against it. So thank you so much, Zach. That was incredible. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody here did. So I'll just kind of start. There were a couple questions on the chat. The first one came from Roberta. She was curious about the plethora of cruise ships in Alaska. I mean, you're based out of Alaska, so I think this is where this was coming from. So, what does the effect of those cruise ships not only have on the local environment there in Alaska, but just the climate as well?
Cruise ships are carbon bombs, no doubt about it. I think it's all part of that systemic change piece. The cruise ship industry isn't going anywhere unless there's a political movement to do that. And no doubt people learn things on cruise ships. They learn about birds, they learn about ecosystems. It's a relatively cheap way to take a vacation. Sometimes people save up for years to do it. So I don't vilify it at every turn. But what the idea that the people who go on cruises in general are fine people. But the cruise industry is just like so many other industries. It is not reckoning in any way or being held to account for its vast damage. What I think of even more than the carbon emissions from cruises is just the way that they destroy the communities that they come into. And this is something that we can see so clearly. The waterfronts in Juneau or Sitka or the towns around me have gone from being a real community space to just a tourist shop crowded hellscape. All of the shops are owned by the cruise industry. They disgorge people onto these tiny little streets, tens of thousands of them, and they funnel them into diamond shops that are owned by the cruise industry. It's like, who goes to Alaska to buy a diamond? It's so thank God my small town of Gustavus, we don't get the cruise ships. They go past us and go up into Glacier Bay. And but like I said, that can be a lifetime highlight for some of the people on those ships. So it's complicated. It's a complicated issue. But decarbonizing the cruise sector will be part of a global movement.
Excellent. Thank you. And then let's see, I see Paula, you have your hand raised. So Paula, go ahead and unmute yourself and fire away.
Yeah, I had just about finished a message asking about the destruction of nature and wildlands from mining for the minerals that we need to electrify everything when you started talking about exactly that issue. I'm a little disturbed by the conflict of saying, yes, it's the fossil fuel industries that are creating this pressure against mining for the minerals that are needed. And the fact that there are people, for instance, here in Patagonia, in the whole Suarita and south in the area of the Santa Ritas, who are facing the destruction of their immediate environment. How do we deal with that discrepancy? And I don't think the people in Save the Scenic Santa Ritas or the Patagonia area, I forget what PARA stands for, but within that group, have been bought by the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you very much for that question. And don't bet that there isn't fossil fuel money in those groups, first of all. But also, it's real, right? It is a real challenge. It is a real problem. And this is what democracies theoretically are good at, is to make or at least are good for, is to make decisions collectively about what is in our national and global interest, right? And that we weigh these challenges of a certain amount of destruction, because you cannot provide energy to 8 billion people without having some impact, versus the counterfactual, which is what's happening now, that is destroying every ecosystem on Earth. And so, you pointed to certain specific groups in, in Nevada, there's lithium mining happening, in Patagonia, and I sympathize with those groups, and the question of whether we're going to go forward with those projects in those particular places will be decided through a tug of war, political tug of war, influence, propaganda, and everything else that goes into those. But ask yourself, why do we hear their stories and not the millions of stories of people whose homelands have been destroyed by the fossil fuel industry? Why are we hearing in particular the stories of people who are being impacted by mining for renewables? And the reason is because very powerful actors have a stake in making sure those are the stories we hear, not the ones from Nigeria, not the ones from Venezuela.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for a lot of great information on the need to change perspective. I think that's a really important takeaway from this, to our changing perspective on what we do and who we do it with.
Awesome. Thanks, Paula. Have a couple more from the chat here. Janice asks, she wants the Arizona retirement system out of fossil fuel investment. Is there anyone working on that who could help me with the first steps? I got to say, Janine, just before Zach answers, I don't know much about the Arizona retirement system, but maybe Zach will know more about this. But if not, I can try to do a little bit of research and reach back out later today. But Zach, if you have an answer for this, feel free.
That question makes my heart sing a little bit, because the climate movement advances one campaign at a time. A campaign to get a college campus onto renewable energy, a campaign to build a particular solar project in Arizona, a campaign to elect a particular climate champion to Arizona's Public Utility Commission, which will then allow the rooftop solar to flourish in that state. One campaign at a time. A campaign to divest Arizona's public, retirement fund is an amazing campaign. And I can't tell you whether it is already happening. I suspect that it is. I suspect there's already people working on this, but I suspect it will be an uphill battle, and they need all the help they can get. So I think it's just a matter of starting to talk with people who are involved in that organization and saying, have you heard whether anybody's pressuring them to clean up their investments and move them out of fossil fuels? You may hear yes, or you may hear nobody's doing that, but it is a ripe target, just a great target for you to get involved in this movement.
Excellent. Thanks for that question. Gary has a question. about asking if you could name a few climate activity organizations that you could recommend joining. People doing good grassroots work out there to help us give more power to our voice.
Thank you. I'll mention two. There are hundreds, if not thousands, and some are more effective than others. And I don't have a monopoly on this answer, that's for sure. But I'll mention two that I really believe in. Both of which have a significant presence in the electoral side, because that's maybe the biggest lever. But the first one I'll mention is called Third Act. Third Act is Bill McKibben and many other co-founders, but it's his latest. He's a serial social entrepreneur, and this is his latest preneur. What Third Act does is mobilizes an overlooked slice of humanity, the electorate, that is experienced Americans, which is to say those over 60 years old. Often older folks are kind of written off. It's got, people become more conservative as they age. They're probably not that interested. This is a young person's movement. Third Act just gives the lie to those narratives, and so there's just an army of white hairs right now being mobilized by McKibben and his co-founders and they really focus in two places: taking on the big banks to get because people over 60 have the most money. 70% of the wealth in America is controlled by people over 60. Okay. So they have the most money, so they have power. And then also, Third Act is, of course, laser focused right now on the on this election, the next 61 days. So that is one organization that you can volunteer through to get out the vote in Arizona. Is Third Act. By the way, people over 60 also vote in the highest numbers, and so the gray hairs have a lot of power to move the conversation and move the power structure around climate. So that's one. The other one I'll mention is called Climate Cabinet. Already the Harris and Trump campaigns, along with super PACs, have raised something like $1.3 billion. And so if you've got $50 to donate, it's not going to do very much in the Harris-Walz Victory Fund. So where does money actually go the furthest? Well, this is where can you have great bang for your buck? This is where Climate Cabinet steers people. They're focused on state and local elections that are overlooked and underfunded, but that have real climate implications. And so your $50 or your volunteer hours will go much further with these particular elections than with the presidential election. And by the way, if those state and local elections are happening in Arizona, which many of them are, then if those down ballot candidates do well, Harris and Walz do well too, right? So there's this up ballot reverse coattails effect. So anyway, I really think that that if you're gonna make a small donation, Climate Cabinet is one of the most effective places to put your money that really shifts power structures.
Wonderful. We have a question from Annie. I'm sure, working with a lot of young people like you do, Zach, you probably get a question similar to this quite a bit. Annie was wondering if you have any suggestion or resources for people who are seeking jobs in the climate change industry and helping to, push against that.
Thank you for another great question. First of all, I'll start with any job except for fossil fuel executive, but any other job can be a climate job. That's because even if you're working in fashion or working in government, a government agency, or if you're working in tech, there is basically no organization on the planet that is doing everything it could be doing for climate. And so you can, with whatever employer you have, or if you're a research scientist, whatever it is, with whatever employer you have, you can push from within to do better. Is our company, is our retirement plan divested from fossil fuels? Is our vehicle fleet electric? Are we buying renewable energy rather than fossil energy? If we're a big organization that does lobbying activities, are we lobbying for climate champions and climate action, or are we lobbying for fossil fuels? All of these are our investments clean in clean energy rather than fossil. So basically, any group that you work for, you can be pushing to be better on climate. That's one thing that I would say, is that any job can be a climate job. But if you really want to be in the climate sector, something that people would recognize as where you feel like, oh, I'm making a difference, that that's more tangible. Some of those jobs are in the nonprofit sector. Some of those jobs are in philanthropy, in clean tech, which is being very disruptive, as Silicon Valley likes to say, or running for office. There's a lot of them. You could write to me, and we could have a longer conversation about this. I have some resources to point out. But one thing I would just say, listen to David Roberts' podcast Volts, which highlights once or twice a week people who are in the good work of decarbonization. And so a lot of those are in clean tech startups, but it ranges all over. He just had a guest on who's doing climate voter registration work. He's had on people in the social sciences, people in urbanism, which is to say to make walkable and bikeable cities, and have less car dependent and sprawling cities. It ranges all over, and these are just stories of the real people out there doing the real work to on the ground. They're not writing white papers. They're not doing roadmaps for decarbonization. We have plenty of those. What we need is people on the ground doing the hard work of decarbonization. And that's the stories that are highlighted. And you'll find plenty of inspiration in that podcast.
Excellent. I actually have a question of my own, but before I do, I just want to let you know, Zach, I don't know if you can see the chat, but we've got people furiously exchanging emails about the Arizona retirement thing. So it's cool that we got that ball rolling and that y'all are connecting
Awesome.
over here
I
in the
love
chat.
that.
So
And
yeah,
let me add my email to the group just so that everybody has it.
cool.
And in particular, I would love to hear from any of you on the election. I mean, 61 days. It will make or break our climate future, the next 61 days, and that's not overstating. It's the biggest thing that's happened in climate in forever. And so again, I will be coming to Tucson in person. If you're interested in meeting me or helping to get a few more butts in seats for that event, so that we can have a bigger community, a bigger audience that is thinking about the importance of this election. That's October 12th. And also, just if you want to follow up about, here's how I'm thinking of getting involved, whatever, use me as a resource on that. Okay.
Cool. Well, October 12th is World Migratory Bird Day, so we'll be honored that you'll be in Tucson on that day.
Oh,
But my
awesome.
question was, when it comes to things like carbon credits, is that just kind of greenwashing to kind of make us feel better that we're pumping more carbon into the atmosphere, or is that something that actually is doing any good at all?
Boy, so there are, so I can tell you this. Voluntary carbon markets are a poster child for grift, fraud, and ineffective greenwashing.
Yeah.
So and there's just been one expose after another about how these voluntary carbon markets, they do absolutely nothing to keep carbon out of the atmosphere, and it's just shell games that kind of push emissions around in this great trading network where a few people profit. It's an absolute mess. On the other hand, there are actual regulated carbon markets. California has one. There's one in the northeastern United States called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Most important in the world is the carbon market in the EU, which is and regulated carbon markets where carbon credits can be bought and sold, and there's a cap that ratchets down over time. Those can be effective. They're not as simple and transparent and probably effective as just a straight up carbon tax that makes fossil fuels more that makes fossil fuels reflect the actual social cost of carbon. Fossil fuels are way cheaper than the effects that society pays. But I would say that regulated carbon markets can be effective. Just be very skeptical when you when someone said when you buy an airline ticket and they say, would you like to give $30 more to offset your flight? It's almost certainly horseshit.
Okay. That's what I thought. I'm glad you could confirm that for me. Let's see. Dan has a question about how much do the world's wars disrupt our climate calculations? It's a good question, Dan. Sorry.
That's a fascinating question, Dan. And I honestly don't know how to answer that. Many much ink has been spilled over the years about how, if the United States military were a country, it would be the number one emitter. So it's just it's like the largest carbon emitting entity in world history. I think the ways it's so complicated the way that world events unfold, because the most recent and current war is Putin's invasion of Ukraine, in which he was using, Putin is a petro dictator. He uses fossil fuels to fund his war, and also as a cudgel, as a threat, to where it's like we will cut off Russian gas supplies to the EU, using fossil fuels as a weapon of war. Well, how does the EU respond? I'll tell you how the United States responded to the fossil fuel industry. They were like, oh my God, this is our great opportunity to drill a shitload more US gas and export it to the EU, So, but the way that the EU responded more so was to basically enact an EU Green Deal and rapidly escalate the amount of green energy that they were building. And so that's why that headline, that renewables had just surpassed fossil fuels in the EU electricity sector, which nobody would have predicted. It happened because Putin invaded Ukraine, and they just doubled down on their efforts to build green energy fast. And it just goes to show that when nations get serious about it, they can do it. There are no, we can power our societies with renewables. We just have to do it. And Putin's war convinced the EU to do it. So it's even that one example, there were different forces, that some of which were trying to increase emissions because of that war, some that were trying to decrease emissions because of that war. So it's just world events are so complex. So the best the climate movement can do is push, and then global events will either help or set back that cause, and then we just push again. Oh, Donito, you're muted, looks like.
Give me another 3 years of being on Zoom and I'll get it.
Yeah.
Just real quick, so we don't have any more questions left, but I just wanted to share my screen real quick as I make a few announcements. This is my oldest. This was a few years ago. We were when I was still living in Texas. This is the Texas Capitol. We were in the climate strike in September of 2019. So I've got a little climate warrior at home. It's great. He keeps me honest. But what I wanted to say before we all have a chance to thank Zach one last time, a lot of you have asked about ways to get involved. I'll send it out in the email that I send out later, but we actually have 2 canvassing events coming up. We partner with the Environmental Voter Project. So we go out, we do birding for about an hour and a half, and then we go do targeting canvassing. It's a lot of fun. It's nonpartisan canvassing, so you don't really have too many angry people slamming doors in your face. It's more about we've identified people who have said that climate and the environment is important to them, but they are low propensity voters. So we feel if we can just get them to vote, they will vote in a way that we would, cross our fingers, hope that would make us happy. So I'll include both of those in there. We've got one coming up in September and one in October. And then I'll also put a link in there to some information about the Arizona Corporation Commission, because 3 of those seats are up on this election. It's a major thing. So I've got some information for that. So I'm going to attach that to the email as well. So just be looking for that. And then as I was running my mouth, just a thanks. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So at this time, I always ask everybody, unmute yourself. Please tell Zach, thank him, all the appreciation. You can go back and watch the YouTube videos if you think I'm lying, Zach, but I will say it. This is probably my favorite virtual event that we've had. Like I said, climate is something I'm really passionate about, and I really enjoyed the message that you gave us today, and just can't thank you enough.
The pleasure is all on this side of the Zoom screen. And Donito, that is fascinating that you all partner with the Environmental Voter Project. That is the most recent Volts episode from David Roberts. He was hosting the director of the Environmental Voter Project. And I just learned about that for the first time. I love it. Get involved, do those, Tucson Audubon, do those canvassing events, because you're gonna get people who think that who say that climate is their top priority. You're gonna get them to the polls. That's what we need.
Well, and like you were saying too, our election margins in the last cycle here, especially here in Arizona, they were so narrow that just literally just getting the smallest amount of people could be enough to sway our election. So yeah, it's something we're very passionate about. And again, very passionate about having you on. And so again, thank you, Zach. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Like I said, give me a couple hours. I'll get this put up on YouTube. I'll get an email sent out to everybody. I know Zach put his email in the chat, but I'll also CC him on that email. So that way, if you want to reach out to him, you can do that through there. So again, thank you, Zach. And if anybody, go ahead, unmute. Let's just shower Zach with thank yous as we leave the Zoom.
Thanks, Zach. Right. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Zach. Thanks.
Onward.
All right, see you. And Zach, I hope to see you in October, man. I really want to try to connect with you. I'd love that.
Okay.
All right.
You got it.
Cool, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks for joining us. All righty. Bye-bye.